All right. Welcome to the latest episode of Startup Conversations. I'm Roderick Bates, hosting the show here on CGconnect, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome one guest who I know for a very long time, Melos, and someone who I'd say is a new friend here, Brendon. So perhaps you folks can introduce yourselves.
Thanks a lot for inviting us, Roderick. I'm just gonna introduce myself really quickly. So I'm Brendon, CEO and co-founder of Synaps, former architect and investment manager that decided to do something about where architecture is heading towards. And basically, I'm super excited to talk about AEC and everything around it with you and also with Melos, who's one of our most valuable members in the team.
Absolutely, you're in luck. I like talking about AEC too, and I also know I love talking about the products that I'm involved in. So it's always like describing your own children, you know. It's sort of a never-ending pleasure. So, absolutely, I can't wait to get into Synapse because honestly, I don't know as much about it as I would like. So I'm really interested to dive in and get a little bit more in like the kind of the logic behind it. But one of the things that probably got me most intrigued, to be perfectly honest, is the fact that your team includes Milos because I know him and I also know the work he does, and I know his standards and his knowledge of the industry. And bringing all of that into a startup was a pretty fascinating move. Milos, maybe introduce yourself for those that don't know you, and kind of explain where you came from and how you ended up here.
100%. So I'll keep it as brief as possible. I basically lived in an architecture household my whole life. My father was an architect. I grew up wanting to be an architect. Even though against all my father's advice, I ended up in architecture school. However, it turned out that he was right. After some time, I realized that the most impact I could have in how we live in our buildings is basically making an impact in the tools that design our buildings. So I basically ended up doing some 3D rendering freelance work during my university years. That's where I stumbled upon Enscape. And while trying to learn Enscape for my own freelance work, I realized that there's not as much tutorials and as much education online as it should be. So I realized there was a gap. I went straight to it, started creating tutorials for about 3.5 years, mainly Enscape and 3D rendering. That's how we met. That's how I kind of got into contact with Chaos overall. And yeah, I mean, always interested in the AEC software space. And me and you, Roger, have talked about obviously me in the future being involved in AEC software. But I guess the stars aligned at the right timing just when I was looking to make that move. And basically got introduced to Brendon, got introduced to the whole Synapse team. It made sense for us, and now we are where we are at the moment. So yeah.
So what I really like about this journey, one is against all advice, you still went into architecture, and I think that's something about this as an industry. It's like the people that are attracted to it, they almost like they can't help themselves. There's sort of there's a beauty of the physical world and the built environment for some people that just draws them in, and I think the other side of it too is that even if you're not an architect you can still absolutely appreciate a well developed and well designed space. There's something, there's like that idea of feng shui or something like that, but there is an element where you go into a really well done building, you're like, this is just, it's beautiful. You don't need any specialized training to know what great architecture is. Now, sometimes you need some specialized training to know what, very avant garde architecture is, but certainly not great architecture, in my humble opinion. But you mentioned something that I want to dive into really quickly, which is this idea that you started out doing tutorials, which I think kind of undersells what you did, to be perfectly honest. Now, you were identifying trends. Like I remember the first place I saw AI visualization actually and for ArcViz was with you, Milos. You did that probably in like late 2022, early 2023 or something like that maybe, where like no one was really even doing anything that looked good and you were comparing it. Probably didn't really like seeing this, but it raised some alarms. You were comparing AI visualization tools versus an Enscape render of the exact same scene. And I had my shoot moment, if you will, when I saw what you were doing, right? So there's that element of like, I remember you doing some things very early. But then this other piece here where working for a startup, you're basically just throwing, you have made a pivot where you're not bound by the tradition of what you've done in a lot of ways. It sounds like when I look at what Synaps is doing, it is completely different from all the type of visualization that you were doing as far as those tutorials or what you may have learned in school. And is
So
that indeed the
that was
case? Like, are you doing something here where, what are you pulling from your experience, essentially, given that so much of your experience was in a technology that maybe isn't as relevant?
so what I think is what transfers and what works well in the pivot is the fact that we're still talking to the same audience. So it's still architects that we're communicating with, interior designers and architects mainly. Um, so is the internet working well? Can you hear me fine?
I don't know. We'll find out with Riverside after the fact. I'm hoping that it's recording you as you talk and it'll upload it later. I think that's how it's supposed to
Yeah.
function.
Okay, can you hear me now? Can you
Oh,
hear
yeah.
me now? Okay, awesome. All right.
Yep, still can.
So I
But
was
I can
saying
also ask Brendon the same question, actually, because you came from someplace totally different.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I guess that there is this issue with connection, so I'll try to
Yeah, because
take
right,
over
because
this.
we definitely want to talk about what Synapse is, but I always like knowing about the guest first. And
Yeah,
I looked through your bio, and it was like, okay, you were doing real estate, portfolio management, like
yeah,
completely different, right?
yeah.
And now you're doing this, and I like, okay, what's the thread, right? When you will put this through, yeah, sure, they're both buildings, but they're pretty different in a lot of ways.
And that's a great point. I mean, I would say that I've kind of been on the other side of the table in every possible seat. So I've been currently already over a decade in the industry. So I've been an architect initially. So I've designed in every single possible software you can even imagine, and also some of them which you might not even know, which are not around anymore. So I've done that. I was on the portfolio management, as you said, the investment manager in real estate, and because I had like all these different points of views, and also I saw very clearly one thing, which I think that each of us who has worked in the industry knows is the fragmentation issue. So the fragmentation issue was maybe the major point which I was suffering myself, and there was a trigger event when I was doing a project in Africa, in Kenya, actually, and I'm based in Vienna, Austria, and the project was there, so I had to fly every second or third week, and I hated the commute just to manage the design process with
Yeah,
people
that's quite a
who
commute.
indeed. So I had to travel to manage the design process with the stakeholders there, and I was just thinking how isn't such a collaborative tool in our space. At the time, I think it was the rise of real-time collaborative tech. Think of Figma, Miro, Canva, etc. And it just made sense that something like this had to be built in our industry. And yeah, I had the luck to meet my co-founders who were already in the space, and I know that they were exceptional people in their own domain to build such a product. And I, coming from the industry, I thought that it would be a challenge to take over, and that's how it started actually.
I like it. So there's two things I want to scratch there that I really like. One is, fragmentation. What does fragmentation mean, and what is your definition of that? But then the other thing that I want to get into is what is the it? What is Synapse? We were talking about it in very general terms, both you and Milos, basically, founders more or less in this particular context. So what is it? What is it? How is it different? It's always tough because we're doing a podcast to describe a software here, but Yeah, I'm say what's the elevator pitch, or
Absolutely.
maybe what's the escalator pitch? I think elevator
I
might be
mean,
too short. So
I mean, before even getting to there, I'll go back to the first question, which was the fragmentation, because I think
yeah,
that would kind of unveil the rest. So fragmentation could be seen in multiple segments within the AEC space, but the major fragmentation we see is actually the fragmentation between CAD and BIM. So, we have these traditional CAD users already, AutoCAD being there, the standard legacy tool from
and it's wild. The numbers aren't going down. That was the funniest part.
exactly.
It's like I look at these, I'm always thinking about, okay, where can we go with our products and things like that. And I'm looking at this, and there's like this 40% of buildings that are designed using CAD, and it hasn't budged in years.
Exactly, and that's exactly. I think that's the elephant in the room. That's actually how I call it. It's something that no one talks about in our industry. Everyone focuses about this BIM 2.0 and about this BIM future, while actually the gap between CAD and BIM is huge. And the more time passes, the more that gap actually is increasing. And I think that this is something we need to do something about. So on one side, you have the CAD users, which is the majority of the industry. Let's not think only architects, because architects don't work in silos. There is a huge list of other stakeholders who take part in the design process, and they are not BIM specialists, right? So you have that
You know,
on
they're
one
not BIM
side.
specialists, but they need the data, or they need the type of data that generally does reside in a BIM model.
Exactly. And then the architects on the other side, you have the major enterprises that are using this very heavy BIM, and that's why they never are in the same space. They never find themselves in the same environment. Some use CAD, some use BIM. I mean, especially I don't know how it is currently in the US, which I think it would be similar, but in the European market, we have ArchiCAD users and Revit users and AutoCAD users, and even companies hire only people who know a particular software, right? So software has become such a crucial part of a full profession, and we thought with AI and in the current day and age, we think that this gap between CAD and BIM will start getting smaller and smaller, and we would be the ones that would bridge this gap. So, in a nutshell, or the elevator pitch is Synapse is actually bridging the gap between CAD and BIM through artificial intelligence. And in that sense, we're allowing users to design and plan, draft as well, with the simplicity of a CAD tool, or even simpler than that. Ideally, the way that we approach this with the simplicity of a pencil and a paper, but with the informational data of a BIM tool. So AI takes over the complexity, while users still design in a fluid way, and that fluidity is the creativity of the architect.
So there's two things I would want to ask here. One is, you think about, okay, what is the complexity of a BIM tool as you put it? I'm like, well, one side of it, just from a really simplistic perspective, they're generally 3D. All right, and CAD's not. So that's one element, and then the other element, of course, is the I part of it, right? All of the metadata and whatnot that goes into it. Things that are related to families and various parameters associated with given objects and things like that. Is that something that you are doing here then, in the sense of that's the complexity that you're able to bring with AI?
I mean, the idea, Roderick, is that we have to start somewhere, right? And we have to start where the majority of the market is currently standing. So that's actually why we started in a two-dimensional interface. That's also why we started with so the initial beta launch we had was with just very primitive tools to actually have there the basics, the fundament, right? The big vision of Synapse is actually no interface. So we want to remove the whole interface. We want to remove every single parameter and sidebar that you have that, and have just a prompt bar. And this
So
is
you're
the
you're you're basically just you're modeling via
by talking
discussion
to it.
or
Yeah,
interaction.
conversationally. Yeah, exactly. So that's the big vision of Synapse. And for us to get there, we need data, and we need this kind of parametric data that you were talking about. So I cannot say a lot about the next steps of us, but just know that the next steps of Synapse would actually be walking towards that direction. One of them, the parametric part of it, and then simplifying that parametric part through decomposing the UI in a sense.
So
Think of the
but you
typical.
mentioned something here that maybe that isn't even true. I think you might have dissembled right from the get-go. She said we're working on the connection between CAD and BIM, but you're not. You're trying to go from CAD and leapfrog BIM. This reminds me of how people go from like no cell phone or no phone infrastructure period to having cell phones. Like, there's some countries that like to skip the middle step, and that's kind of what you're
Yeah,
proposing in some ways.
absolutely, absolutely. And that is, I mean, in the bigger picture, you're right, but the gap is actually unifying the whole industry. That was the big idea.
That
So
is the gap,
with
yeah.
exactly. Yeah.
Well, that's a pretty bold vision. And then I'm thinking, okay, well, where does visual communication fit into a model like that? Like what is the role of visual communication in the context of something like that? Because so many of what we work with are these models that are there that look a certain way because they need to convey a certain type of data with a certain level of clarity, right? They're sort of necessary abstractions. And we have a bunch of different types of necessary abstractions that are used when designing buildings. What does that look like in the context then of your vision for Synapse? I'm thinking like one is like Milos, like your background to degree, which I've interacted with you, has always been around very legible visual communication. But then there's all these other components that, if you really are fulfilling this vision, aren't necessarily traditionally things that are communicated in sort of a visually intuitive or realistic manner.
So I would start by emphasizing the fact that visualizations are, um, well, these days I kind of see them also as a barrier to most successful products, and I'll lay this out how I think that. So if you think about it, like all of these standalone rendering tools, they have a big supply chain risk in the sense that most native design and 3D modeling tools are going to be able to host their own rendering engine or rendering capabilities within the software without needing any third
Yeah, I
party.
don't want to name names because it's always threatening, but yeah, I mean, there's some stuff that's right now out in beta. You're like, hot damn, that looks looks pretty good.
100%. So I think the visualization part is very easily commoditized nowadays in the sense of the output, but not so
The
much
traditional visualization.
the traditional or even in the artificial intelligence part, because right now anyone who does AI renders basically uses two main models mostly, right? So it's either the Google model or it's Midjourney, right? That's like 95% of the market. So if you think about it, what makes a difference is the user experience and the way that you allow the customizability. Because if you think about it overall, there's a bunch of AI slop, which is called nowadays, that's coming out every single day in the architecture space. But we really try to identify ourselves in a way that gives you the AI capabilities and the AI speed while still allowing you to maintain control at the moment, right? So we're not fully branded in that sense where AI comes off as tacky or comes off as I would say a non-professional or non-mature. So the visualization part, I think we're mainly trying to look at it at a point of view of how can we improve user experience and make it as seamless as possible. Because I mean, we both know that there was a time in our space where visualization was a final pretty picture on the wall. That was what V-Ray did best, and that time. But then when Enscape came in and made it real time, and the fastest real time that was out there, visualization became part of the design process rather than a final result. So we're trying to bring all of this in one canvas while still allowing the user experience to be the fastest and the easiest to be integrated within the design process.
So you mentioned, this idea of AI slop, and that's true. And there's this element here where the ease of production itself creates a risk. It's like someone will send me a report and it's 12 pages. And it's 12 pages because they use AI to write it. And if they were writing it themselves, it probably would have been 3 paragraphs and really nice and tight. And so I think that's part of the challenge, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the tools themselves are to blame, and that if you had a really good user that was exercising discipline, I still feel like they could do it right. And so I'm wondering here, in the context of something like Synapse, that comes down to how you frame and communicate the information. Like how do you exercise judgment on what you communicate, and what is the goal of what you're communicating? Like, why am I showing this to someone? Brendon, you sat on multiple sides of the table, but I'm thinking in the context of, like, say, where you're managing a portfolio, people probably came and tried to show you things, and they were, I would hope, really tailor the information to say, okay, I want Brendon to leave this room having made these 3 decisions, something along those lines, right? And I'm thinking, okay, a big problem with the AI, though, is it just creates so much content that people are losing sight of why did I create it in the first place? And you created it to drive a decision, oftentimes, like to really communicate something very clearly, and to either create a comprehension, or to alternatively drive a decision because of that comprehension.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there is one thing, Roderick. I think that, like, in an architect's job, for example, there was, I don't know, that was, I think, Jonas Salk, who was the contractor of the Salk Institute, who contracted Louis Kahn. And he said that the answer doesn't matter at all. What matters is the question. And I think that now, in the day of AI, that's actually the most important part. And that's exactly also in such products and in such experiences, I would say. The question is what matters. So with AI, you can get all over the place, and you can get, as you said, 10 pages for something that could be compressed in a paragraph. But if you ask the right question, you get that the answer you want in an instance, right? So if we observe that on a product level, and this is also what we're trying to do in Synapse, is that you can contextualize your design. And if you contextualize your design, then if you ask the right questions to AI, you get the answer you need, right? So you can bypass the process of actually having to go through multiple steps to getting that information.
But you
And
need to
and
know what that right question is, right? Both of
exactly,
you are
exactly.
architects, so you know to some degree, and with experience, so you know what that question is to ask. How would someone coming in green know what those questions are asking? I mean, you described your ultimate interface, Brendon, of like just it's just basically a dialogue box. It's like, boy, you could be asking a lot of terrible questions in that particular context.
I mean, you could observe that as a minus or a plus point. On one side, it could be actually an educational process of actually asking the wrong questions until you get it right. And I think that's also like a process in which non-architects can actually get into a sensible output, right? So, I mean, we're not here trying to replace architects, and I think this is like the biggest myth out there, that AI or AI software or in architecture specifically are coming to replace architects. We're not replacing architects. That's far from
No,
what
I
we're
mean,
doing.
in some ways, you're almost elevating the importance of the architect, because in the wrong
Exactly,
hands, the danger of these tools is even greater.
exactly.
And the uselessness of them in a lot of ways is even greater. But it gets to me thinking about what you've done historically, Milos, with all of the training, and it's like, well, actually, that need's still there in a lot of ways, and perhaps in a completely different direction, to help people understand how to use this new type of tool and this new way of thinking about design. At one point, that was Enscape. Now it's something different. What do you think education that needs to look like for this next generation of tools?
I think so. To be honest, I'm not sure I fully agree with the statement in the sense that the education obviously still needs to be there. However, it's a lot more compressed and direct, right? So if you actually look at, let's say, the online info space, so the info industry in terms of AI, like what every single AI course out there is doing is basically just prompt packs, right? So they're just teaching people how to prompt. And what I think is important to distill is that the education in terms of visualization may not be as prevalent or as desirable by people to buy, because most of it is being given free online anyway, right? So you can just watch a video, see someone do like 8 prompts, and then like there's not much more they can dive deeper into it. But the education which still remains very valid is the part of how do you understand design itself and then translate it into visuals, or what I would say is even more important in the sense of translation, because I think overall the workflow of taking a design idea into a prompt is basically translation between the visual that you have into your mind, translating it into words, and then those words are going to have to retranslate those words into an image generation AI, and it's about how clear was the translation between the vision you had in your mind, the words you're typing in, and how much does a generation of AI actually reflect what you thought about. So,
Right? You have to be a critic, right? I mean, you have to be both a teacher and a critic in order
yes.
for that workflow to
So,
work properly.
so it's a lot about, I'm not sure if what the game is called, Broken Telephone, where someone whispers in someone's ear. So it's kind of the same thing with AI as well, where you have the idea, you communicate your idea with the AI, but then the output or the generation is all about how well you deconstructed the image in your mind into words. So I think that's the skill that actually remains super valid, and is something that a lot of creative people still struggle with, I would say.
I mean, it makes you wonder then, what does education need to look like going forward? Is the architectural profession need to rethink what the education might be? But then it also makes me realize too that something that I haven't really dived into here in the context of Synapse is like, well, what about all the other stuff that is required to make a building go, right? Like, the aspects of integrating multiple trades. Like, you have to get the engineers on board, the structural, the civil, the electrical, things like that, like code approval, all this sort of boring but important stuff. Is there a place for all of that in these workflows too?
Indeed. I mean, I would say there is definitely a place, especially for the exact ones that you mentioned. And I think that a lot of these processes could be automated, especially the I don't know, the building permit process, or like the construction or building law inspection, etc., or also the plumbing and MEP and etc. So all of these have a very high potential of automation, and not only that, but they all have a place within a design tool. If the design, if you can design walls and windows and doors and stairs and columns and full structural systems with AI, I'm pretty confident that you'll be able to design also, yeah, plumbing plans and the rest with AI as
So
well.
there's a couple of things there. One, I still want to get back to what the heck is education, or what should education look like. I mean, it's one of these things where, like, if I had a kid that was going off to uh, study in grad school to be an architect right now, like, what's the advice that you would tell them before they leave? Because it's like,
Yeah. I would personally, honestly, I would say to focus on the conceptual part of architecture rather than the technicalities of it. I think this is actually where an architects are the most needed now. If you observe architecture in two main segments, the hand and the mind. So the mind is what comes up with the conceptual part of it, and the hand is what applies that concept. I think is that the hand will be automated and taken care of from AI. So the main duty is to have the right questions, as we said previously.
I like it. That's honestly, for a lot of people, the most fun part of architecture too. But then you're like, you run smack into the realities of what it takes sometimes to deliver a building. You think of like the approval authorities, and they may require everything to be delivered in physical copies. For instance, they want a physical plan that they're going to review. Takes, you know, I don't know, 10 weeks minimum for them to even acknowledge that they received it. There's things like that where it's like the magnitude of the problem in the face of rapidly evolving technology, I think, is just going to lend itself to frustration. It makes you wonder that there'll be certain markets where they're going to show a new way that are more flexible and adaptable, and then there'll be other ones that are going to be more ossified, and then sort of people are going to realize, hey, why am I even putting up with this at this point?
No, and yeah, definitely. I mean, especially our market. I think it was never pioneering technology, so it was always like following, and therefore I think there will definitely be some resistance for sure.
But it's funny though, because when you think about the people that are in architecture, there's a fair number of extremely technically savvy individuals. And also people are using very complex computer programs. Brevit itself is pretty darn complex. You throw Dynamo into the mix, well, that's really complex. A lot of people are using Grasshopper. It's fairly complex. There's a lot of people that are just developing their own programs, period, in architecture. So it's an odd mix of people that are extremely technically savvy, and then a industry itself that's very slow and conservative.
I mean, that's also like kind of the reason, because you theoretically to build such a product as you meant from the ones you mentioned, it's a really hard problem to solve, right? To build a Revit, even if you do it today with all the means that we have today, it's a really hard problem to solve. So in other industries, you can vibe code software for make it as a weekend project, but you cannot do this in our space, you know? So if you invest the time to build such a tool, you will definitely stick to it, and it's going to be hard to change it.
I think there's also one more view to look at this in the sense that I don't think the architecture professionals are lacking the knowledge to use heavy software or complicated software. It's more so the bravery needed or the trust needed into using new tools because if you think about it, like architecture projects are kind of like a governmental contract where you actually get the stamp, get approved, get the permit. And it's risky to try or switch from something which you've used for 20 years into a tool that just came out last year in that sense. However, that also makes us very clearly understand how much trust matters in the equation of being able to serve architects. Because no matter how much they see potential in a tool and no matter how amazed they are at the capabilities that it has, if it does not trust it to produce professional drawings that actually get approved, that get a permit, that don't per se generate errors in terms of getting the work and the building built, then I think that's where it falls off.
You're absolutely right. I mean, if you talk about a risk-averse industry, and in many ways rightly so, and maybe in other ways more legally so, but maybe not as quite as sort of as an imperative, but it is legally an imperative at least. But then I'm like, okay, you're in a startup here. You're providing a completely different way of designing buildings. I would love to hear your plan of how you are overcoming that initial resistance.
I mean, it's good that I've kind of been thinking about this for like 4 years, so we're kind of ready for that. But I think it mainly so we look at the trust factor mainly in terms of the amount of time that someone spends using Synapse. So how fast they can get activated and actually learn the product. And I think what is the bigger hurdle is actually getting um, major buildings or competitions done, or I guess real buildings being built while using
Yeah,
Synapse.
right. Something that's been stamped, approved, permitted, and built. I mean, that's the proof's in the pudding here.
Yes, 100%. So the path to that obviously comes down to also having a very like precise and well built tool, which our technical team is definitely done some amazing work in the background. So that's something very exciting. But then I think it all comes down to building trust through testimonials and case studies, which is something that we're definitely going to double down on as soon as we get the product out there.
I mean, this is a big delta though between these other BIM 2.0. Yeah, you mentioned BIM that you're not BIM 2.0, right? But like that's the I'm going to make the comparison anyway, whether you like it or not. But what's funny about a lot of them is that they're going after the early design stuff. They're nibbling around at the space of like design exploration, not documentation. And what that does is it's like, that's the level of design where there's not a lot of liability. There's not a lot of precision, not a lot of accuracy, that kind of thing. Like you can play fast and loose at that stage, but you're saying no, you're going for the hardest part here.
We're going for the hardest part, but we're not starting at the hardest part. So it's of course you'll start early on at the process, and it makes sense where also all these BIM 2.0 tools, as you mentioned, they're starting at, I don't know, feasibility studies, for example, or volumetric modeling, etc. But then that makes sense because you cannot just compete with Revit on its own turf. In our case, what we're doing actually is that we're coming as close to that point as we can, while already still being in the early design stage. So if you think about the early design phase, you have the conceptual design, schematic design, and design documentation prior to getting to the construction documentation. Now, if you can have one single tool which can take over this whole process, right, and then the handover to your beam of choice is easy, then it makes the point you mentioned before. How do you actually get into this? People who have been used with the singular workflow for decades and decades, it's actually just integrating into their daily work. If they cannot do something in any other tool, but that they can do it only in yours. And I can tell you this, that on the product that is launching this summer, we have a dozen of such features that are only in Synapse and you cannot find in any other tool. There is definitely a high incentivizer to use this product, and then of course you can continue and hand it over to a tool of choice.
But you still have to have that record scratch where you hand it over. I don't want that anymore.
And
What keeps us? What keeps all these tools still having to do that? Is it
I
tradition?
mean
Is it customer resistance? Or is it dysfunctional capabilities?
that's in a sense, and I mean, I'm saying it out loud, but this is a Trojan horse concept here. So basically, we need to have that handover now. We need to be able to get into that space, and once the Trojan horse has worked, then we make that handover. Well,
But people are
actually,
still
not make
printing
sense
out
anymore.
printing out the construction drawing set, right? So it's like you're still going up to BIM and then back down to another format. It's like, why even have to make this stop over here in BIM land?
I would say, yeah, I would just jump in the sense that it's not so only about having the interoperability with BIM only. SketchUp could be an option as well, right? So I think it also goes to show not just so it goes to show that it's going to be a transitionary period between our ultimate goal of not having an interface, which this part of the interoperability with BIM and SketchUp and all these other parts is just a stepping stone towards that.
I mean, the other way of looking at it too, and it's something I hear more and more from people, is that they want their data to be free. If they want to take it into SketchUp and mess around with it a little bit and then bring it back over to another place, fine. Like,
Hmm.
why not, right? I mean, that's the other side of like, is there a way in which you can make data portability that seamless? Because
And
no tool is going to be perfect for everything. Like,
I
you
think
go into a garage of a mechanic, right, and there's just a sea of tools, right, and a perfect one for every job. And some of them they even make themselves, right? And I think there's something to be said for that type of flexibility.
I think I'm going to say something which might benefit our competitors even in terms of data. But I think I'm going to say it because it's important to know that one of the most hated tools out there that still has a lot of users and a lot of people buy it is the layout tool of SketchUp. So, like the layout tool that SketchUp offers, everyone complains about it. If you go into forums, if you go into Reddit, if you go into YouTube comments and everything, it's like the most complained architecture tool out there. So the least that will 100% do, and I'm saying this on the pessimistic side, is that we'll at least provide that part of the process for the SketchUp users. You know what I mean? It's that point of view in this as well.
But you have to make it so frictionless that it's worth using just for small
Yes.
things, right? I think
Yes.
that's part of, and there's been this walled garden mentality for a while in the industry. It's like, okay, you're in the Autodesk world, getting your data out of the Autodesk world. Yeah, you can do it, but we're not going to make it easy. Um, and you're probably going to lose some information in the process and things like that. But what you're saying is, in fact, if you want to provide some type of a key functionality that's missing elsewhere, or just better than elsewhere, you got to be able to get into Synapse and out of Synapse really efficiently.
And the difference between, and sorry for interrupting, Brandon, just one last thing. The difference between, if you think about it in a macro perspective, between what I said and rendering engines being a um, third-party tool or an extension of other tools, is that they usually come as at a later part of the process. Meanwhile, if you're in the early process of the supply chain of architecture tools, which is like the 2D drafting in the sense, let's say we replace the layout part, there's a lot less risk there's less risk of getting cut off by native design tools. So in that sense, SketchUp is our extender instead of us being the extendable part.
Also, one thing I need to mention is like if we talk about here statistically, uh, these are maybe like a bit older statistics, but don't quote me on it on how they're nowadays. But 27.5% of everyone working in the AEC industry still uses AutoCAD, and they do their whole workflows in AutoCAD only. And 25% uses AutoCAD and the BIM of choice, so basically two tools. And I was surprised by that, but this also in the context of this topic we're talking about, these kind of users, which is actually 27.5 up to 45 or 50% of the market, would actually in Synapse or find that Synapse and facilitate their whole processes. So they would not need any other tool of choice whatsoever, right? So they would get from an idea to a client-ready presentation to a building permit to even a construction document within one single tool. And this is actually what we're doubling down on, and for these are the people we're serving first.
That's an
But the
interesting
big
point, though, right? Because everyone's trying to displace Revit, and you're like, nah. I mean, you're just trying to displace a particular user persona, those that are using CAD and those who use CAD in conjunction with BIM. And you're right, they have unique needs.
Exactly, and not only that, but I think that at least in our opinion, that's why I am not a big fan of this BIM 2.0, as you already found out by now, is the fact that I don't think it makes sense to go to build another Revit. I mean, the BIM 2.0 in all the approaches that I've heard so far, it's actually people are building another Revit, maybe in the browser, maybe adding real-time collaboration to it, and some AI features here and there for, I don't know, visualization. But that just doesn't make sense. And I think that in order to build at least our vision of what I mentioned before, like no interface and just a conversational approach to designing, we have to start off laying the right fundamentals and the right groundwork, right? And I think this is where we're currently standing. So what I mentioned now, this is actually the fundamentals of building that vision.
Now, one question I am particularly curious about, thinking about your background, Brendon, is the client side. And that's something that I've always been challenged by is we design visuals, we meaning Chaos, designs visualization tools that are used in a variety of industries. And we talk to the people that use our tools, and we talk to them a lot. But what we don't get to talk to are the people that are consuming the output that's generated by our tool users, right? The clients, if you will, our client's client. And when you think about so much of what's being created here, you're trying to communicate to the person who's writing the check. And I'm curious from your experience, did that start to influence the way you saw Synapse? And I think also too, honestly, with you, Milos, as well. Your ArcViz is about you're not doing that to communicate to yourself necessarily. You're using it to communicate to these third parties. Is that part of the thinking that went into your tool from day one? Is like, okay, how is this tool going to be used to communicate with the person who's writing the check?
Absolutely. I mean, this is actually like maybe the core of our hypothesis in Synapse. Actually, we were always trying to think in terms of we're selling this product to architects in order for them to profit out of it, right? So what are they profiting? Are they profiting in time? Are they profiting in clients, actually, right? So it's definitely a big part of the equation. And I think that if you see even in the initial version that we launched, which, as I said, was a primitive beta, we have some product choices which were made with this in mind, and that our most used tool and feature, which is the camera tool, is actually exactly for that. So usually we've talked with so many clients that they always wanna say, okay, I want to visualize exactly this angle because I cannot visualize it in 2D, right? And building a 3D model or having a 2D tool and having to do that's a challenge. And that's why a lot of architects have to build 3D models just to have that particular
Yeah.
selling point in that moment. And that's what our camera feature kind of addressed. And that was maybe, the most used tool. And a lot of these kind of tools are coming.
How do you get insights from that user group? I mean, this is a little bit of a self-interested question, but I'm always struggling. It's like, I really want to talk to our customer's customer. And boy, that is not an easy ask. And yet, you are our customers, or you were at one point in your career, Brendon. And I think also, when I was thinking about what you were doing, Milos, one of the reasons why you were so successful is I think you had a really good eye for what the customer, the end consumer, wants to see. But I'm just curious. Now you have this thing that's underway. You need to get feedback. How do you get feedback from that particular?
I think one of the most common things that I'm hearing from architects is that the way that they're talking to their clients is changing drastically. So, where previously, in order to get a project started, or let's say an architecture firm got a lead that someone wants to do a project, it would start either by a conversation, a lot like further back. Then it kind of moved into them already sending some Pinterest boards. But nowadays, I hear more and more from architects that clients are approaching them with AI visuals that they already created previously with a vision in mind.
But it's still a visual. They're not giving them a floor plan yet or anything
No,
like that, right?
no, 100%. But having something visual, which so for example, there was a client that I had in Colorado that basically their clients took a picture of their land, gave reference images from Pinterest, and said, just put a house, something like this, in this land. And they approached the client, and the client had to translate that image into documentation drawings, into actually being eligible for like the code compliance and everything else. So a lot of the ways that architects are communicating with their clients now is changing as well, and it's our job to also facilitate that.
It's like you have to work backwards and then work forwards again.
Yes. Yeah, that's why I'm saying that I think the main skill that architects gotta have these days is being able to translate visuals into words and see if the generation actually matches the visual that was in mind.
I mean, it also makes me think, though, do we need tools like Synapse for the clients, for the person that owns the property in Colorado, so that they don't just give some pie in the sky drawing set that like could never be realized. It's like, listen, it's not going to be fire code compliant. It's not going to be structurally possible. It's going to be outside of your budget. I'm sorry, like you're rich, but you're not that rich. All these sort of things. It's almost like the client needs a tool before they even get started, just to kind of like explore some ideas that have some basis in reality.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that in a sense, or in other words, a part of the vision is actually productizing architectural expertise in a sense, right? So if if we actually allow anyone, like the client, type something in there, and the output would be architecturally sensible and
Yeah, it doesn't
structurally
have to be perfect,
sensible.
just kind of
Exactly.
within the realm of
Exactly,
reason.
exactly. I think that we've done like a shortcut of at least like a large percentage of the whole back and forth process that goes in there. So I think that this is definitely something we keep in mind. And since you asked about how we gather feedback on that part, I mean, through the process of creating the Synapse hypothesis, we've interviewed over 150 architectural or people who work in the industry and their clients. So we've
Oh,
sat
you
down
did.
with
So you were able to get in touch with both.
yeah. I
Well,
mean,
hats off to you.
I
That's not
was
easy.
I was myself in the industry, so it was a kind it's a kind of an unfair advantage there. But yeah, we definitely talked with each of the stakeholders and multiple segments. You know, in the single family house and large residential projects, commercial real estate, etc., etc.
Where do you see the biggest opportunity in the short and intermediate term?
I mean, we see it at the 90% of the built environment. The 90% of the built environment are the residential space, is the residential space, and also what the so-called regular buildings. So not the Sydney Opera House and not the Guggenheim Museum, but the regular buildings. Most probably the one you're in at right now and the one I'm in at right now.
Well, mine was definitely pre-CAD, but it is without a doubt a box with windows. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah.
So there's an interesting element there then when you think about what AI is doing in some ways. It's like, okay, maybe that is taking away a portion of the scope of work that used to reside with architects. But it's also evolving what the architect can do and what the role of the architect is. But it's also allowing for more people to play in the space. And I think that that's a net positive, right? It's at the end of the day, it's allowing for more people to be involved in the design process in a way in which their vision can be realized, as opposed to kind of getting what you get and maybe not being able to push back or communicate or negotiate the design. It's giving a very different role for the client. And I would imagine as a client, that would be enormously satisfying. And it would honestly make the whole process a lot more fun.
The question is, would it be as satisfying for the architect as well if the client is so much
Well, a
in the
happy
loop?
client is the most important thing. I mean, if you
Yeah,
ask most architects what's your number one source of new work, and it's probably past clients.
correct. I mean, there is also one other thing which I really want to mention on this point because you mentioned like happy client. Uh, I mean, I think we all can agree that like there is a particular issue currently in the architecture profession, right? So the how the architectural economy and how underpaid are is the average architect, you know, is something that we cannot like avoid, and this is something that like we were thinking a lot in Synaps, right? So we were thinking a lot because there is always this backlash when it comes to our architects actually capable of paying for such a tool, you know, are they used of paying for software, you know, like we all know how the reality on that regard is. And one thing that AI and this approach that we have would do to the architectural economy is actually regulated by allowing architects do more in less time and therefore are getting more clients, right? So the exact work that you do for a client and it'll take you 4 months now can suddenly take you 1 week or 2 weeks, and you can get more clients within those 4 months.
I got raked over the coals on LinkedIn for commenting along those lines because I think for some architects, the idea of more volume isn't as compelling as perhaps using the same capacity to focus on craft. But then you have to say, okay, well, am
Uh,
I able to charge more in that context or charge the same? And it does
I
raise a question like where are fees going, given some of these tools and their capabilities?
I mean, it's great that you made this point because I need to clarify then exactly because architects need to focus on their craft. Exactly that's why, because this makes sense. The thing is that they focus on their craft and then they spend months applying that in a CAD or in a BIM tool, right? So the process of the manual work that's in there is actually what takes the most time. The conceptual design and their craft, as you mentioned, is actually an experimental process, and it's a fluid process. And if we actually let artificial intelligence, in this case, take over the manual process, then they will only be focusing on their craft, and they will see more of their creations actually take place in the real world.
I mean, it depends on which architects you talk to. I remember one architect who, and still, I'm sure he still says it, but that specifications are the most underrated design tool. And so there's this aspect of architecture like that, specifications, details, things like that are very labor intensive, very nuanced, have a specialized skill set that goes along with them, and that isn't the part of early design, right? That isn't the part of coming up with a vision. It's very much in the weeds, fiddly details, but those fiddly details that yield wonderful buildings.
Indeed, yeah, that's definitely true. But I can tell you that I've tried it myself with some experiments that we've done with AI to actually generate multiple details and out of images. And it generate precise details, and it's scary what it can do already. So yeah, I would love to see what this particular architect would say on Synapse V2 or V3.
I mean, I'm always astounded on two things. One is architects' compulsion to make things a complete one-off for a given project. And then two, just the weird ways in which water can get into a building. I am astounded by both of those things. I don't know if AI is going to be better at figuring out, but I mean, I've just some with things you would never anticipate, as far as water infiltration or freeze-thaw cycling or weathering and things like that. I don't know. I've actually really looked forward to figuring out if it's going to be better for some of these things or not. But there is one other element, maybe not so worried too much about architects, as I agree. I think ultimately this is going to be giving capacity to focus on the part that is really the efficiency piece, right? It's like, you're not paying the cook to make a pan so he can cook the food. You're paying him to cook the food, right? And it's like
Exactly.
we kind of like getting focused on all these elements that don't really deliver a better
Exactly.
outcome than why worry about them. But the thing that I am curious about is the development of the software itself. From the time that Synapse started as a company to where we are right now, what it means to have a development team and what that development team has shifted quite a bit, at least coming from my own experience. We're seeing more and more capacity for agentic coding assistance, for one, and things like that. Has that changed the way that you're developing your software? Has it changed the role that both of you can have in the development of the software? And is it also changing what you feel is going to be a competitive software in the next 3 years?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, I would say that we made an opinionated decision early on that most of the developers in our team would have a particular connection with architecture. So we have even developers who have a master's degree in architecture, and they're developing the product. So that was, first of all, we needed that almost at least everyone in the team knows what we're building here. Now on the question of how AI and vibe coding has affected our workflow, it definitely has made experimentation much faster, I would say, and it's definitely a crucial part of the workflow. But I mean, also myself, and I've never coded a single day in my life. I just got an idea on the weekend, and I went and prompted it in Cloud Code, and I just got a quick prototype that I showed to the team. So it definitely has changed my workflow as well. But it's still, I would say, it's building such a product as in our case is still, and I don't know for how long, it's still not fully in the capability of the AI tools. You definitely need to have yeah, very skilled developers and engineers to
I mean,
build such a
isn't that the
product.
point with the architecture as well, right? The client can vibe code a building, but it's a more of a show instead of tell,
Exactly,
and then that has to be taken into an actual product or an actual building.
exactly. Yep, definitely.
There's another very, I would say, traditional or outdated example which comes to mind where I think like 7 or 8 years ago when I applied to the US Embassy for a visa, they actually required an official translator from English to Albanian for like a two-page document, where I actually had to go and pay people to put my document in Google Translate, and all they would have to do is just stamp in it so that the embassy would actually trust that the translation is correct. So in a way, the power is held at the license or the regulation part of it.
Well, it's
And
held
this,
at the liability, right? I mean,
yes,
if it was right, and that's the same thing with buildings, right? Even
exactly,
if it's an AI generated building, if
exactly.
that thing collapses, someone's getting sued, at least in
Exactly.
America.
Yes, exactly. That's I think this is the most primitive case where like Google Translate has been around for like, I don't know, 15, 20 years. But I mean, I still see translators getting a lot of business. So yeah.
I didn't. I'm surprised. I did not think that translators would still get a lot of business.
Yes,
I'm
yes.
glad to hear they are, but
Mhm.
it seems like a bit of an anachronism. I would think like translators and stock photography would be two industries I'd be very worried about right now.
Stock photography, I mean, didn't I think get like one of the big ones, Getty Images or someone like they saw the thread and they sued OpenAI for using their images to train their models. But I mean, stock photography, yeah, it's one of those that I don't see how they can survive.
I have no clue how they're continuing to
Yeah.
survive. I but it's good to hear though that you're like okay it's almost like you developed at the right time in a sense of that you're able to ride this technology evolution. This is something where 4 years prior would have been pretty deadly. I'd have a tool like this right now, and then but it also says okay, how do you stay nimble and adaptable with the way that it's constantly evolving? Sometimes I don't like to go on LinkedIn because I see what's happening and it's happening so quickly. I'm like, oh, geez, can't things just slow down a little bit here? I mean, do you have moments like that where you're thinking, boy, this is moving real fast?
We're trying to be one of those guys that you you look at in
Yeah.
the LinkedIn, you know. I mean, I will say one thing before Melos. There is this company, I don't know, you definitely might have heard of them, called Lovable.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And they have an interesting concept about product market fit. They say that like they are always seeking product market fit, even though they're actually the typical case that they reach product market fit. And that's also like a kind of concept that we have in Synapse is that product wise and with everything we're building, we think of it as on Monday we get product market fit and on Friday we lose it all over, and on Monday we start all over
And as
again,
long as you accept that, life's a lot easier, isn't it?
Exactly,
100%.
exactly.
I mean, I was going to say like, uh, I truly, truly believe this, and I get this, like eureka moment from like we have like a group chat where we get, updates on what's being developed and how everything in the product is going. I truly think that Synapse is going to be one of those generational revolutionary tools in the architecture space. And I'm not saying this out of excitement. I'm not saying this out of, pure optimism. And I'm not saying it's going to be like a very easy road in that sense. But I think it's going to be one of those where, we look back at like the history of the AEC tools and it's going to be a big pivot. And exactly what you said is like the timing it just couldn't be more perfect.
I like that. And that's actually not a bad place to end with a bit of a call to action. So if someone wants to be part of this pivot point and get their hands on Synapse, give it a try, where would you point them?
So synapse.app, synapps.app. That's basically, so right now it's just an open beta, very primitive in compared to what's going to be capable of in a few months when it's open to the public. Yeah, Synapse, that app, that's where people can go ahead and test it out and just get a feel of the potential that it has and nowhere close to the full capabilities. But yeah, either way, I really want to thank you, Roderick, for the opportunity to, display some of our background and our vision and the roadmap. And yeah, I couldn't think of anyone better to share the conversation with.
I've certainly enjoyed it. There's a lot of ideas here that really got me thinking. I have to say, there's a freshness that comes with a startup like this, where like you are truly throwing out the rule book.
Yeah, definitely. And exactly about that, I think this summer we will see the teaser of our big vision that I mentioned of removing the interface, but just the starting point of it. So I would say that it's exciting because we will see it productized in a couple of months from now. And thank you so much, Roderick, for teasing our thoughts and our ideas here. And yeah, we're excited to touch base again once we've done more steps towards this vision.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a never-ending process, isn't it? I love it. It's
Okay.
like you understand the customer needs on Monday and you lose it on Friday. I mean, that's the new reality.
Exactly.
That's great. All right. Well, we're going to end it there. I suppose I will probably edit out anything else there, but that was a great conversation. Really some cool ideas and very different ways of thinking about it. I just love it.
There's just so much that we think about and talk about and execute
Yeah,
on.
but you're doing it too. A lot of people
Yeah,
are like,
that's the
kids in a
thing.
college dorm room, they just talk, but you're doing it.
100%. I mean, there's